In today's episode, we're out here taking a look at the Audi A5. In this generation of the Audi A5, they've done something a little bit interesting, and it's available not only as the coupe that we're looking at right here, and of course the convertible that we've seen before, but also as a four-door liftback. Very much like the 4 Series and the 3 Series are related to one another, this is closely related to the Audi A4. Up front, we have Audi's latest design language. Of course, Audi tends to prefer design evolution to design revolution, so this looks very similar to the Audi A5 that came before it. But if you look a little bit closer, this grille is a little bit larger, a little bit more angular, and a little bit meaner. On each side, we have full LED headlamps, LED high beams, and LED low beams with these distinctive accent strips inside. And lower on the front bumper, you'll notice that we don't find fog lamps. That's because Audi puts their all-weather lamps right here inside the same LED headlamp module. But we do find some aero treatments on either side of the front bumper. These actually pass air through and help reduce pressure up front, giving the entire vehicle better aerodynamics. At 180 inches long, the A5 Coupe is the shortest of the new A5 trio. The A5 Cabriolet gets about 4 inches longer, and the A5 Fastback, which has that fourth door in the back, gets about 6 inches longer. Up front, you'll notice something definitely different than the previous generation of the Audi A5. And that's the distance between the front door and this front tire, and of course the overhang at the front of the vehicle. In this generation of the A5, Audi was able to push the engine a little bit further back than they have in previous versions. The Audi Quattro system in the longitudinal engined vehicles, which would be the A4, A5, A6, A7, A8, prevents them from putting the engine entirely behind the front axle. That's because Audi prefers to package the center differential and the front differential into the same package as the transmission itself. The result is this slightly longer front overhang than something like the BMW 4 Series or perhaps the Mercedes-Benz C-Class. But that does not make this a front-wheel drive car or a front-wheel drive biased car. Now, you can get the Audi A4 as a front-wheel drive vehicle in the United States, but even with it, when you add the Quattro all-wheel drive system, most of the power is going to the rear wheels. Out back, like many luxury vehicles, the overall design theme is restrained and elegant. The tail lamp modules continue this simple band that goes right there from the body on over to the trunk lid. It flares out a little bit on this side, and we have full LED tail lamp modules. Below that, we have twin exhaust tips, and of course, we are driving the A5, so in America, that means we have a 2-liter turbocharged engine and this 2.0T Quattro badge over here on the passenger side. The 2-liter turbo is essentially the same one that we see in a variety of different Audi models. It produces 252 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque. The dual-clutch transmission that we're driving this week is easily one of the smoothest dual-clutch transmissions that I have ever driven. This is not quite as smooth as Honda's 8-speed dual-clutch transmission that we find in the Acura ILX, but this is easily a very close second, and light years ahead of most of the dual clutches out there. Definitely much smoother than what we find under the hood of the Mercedes-Benz CLA or the Mercedes-Benz GLA. If you want a little bit more oomph under the hood, you could get the Audi S5 that gets a turbo V6 engine producing 354 horsepower. But that doesn't use the same 7-speed dual-clutch transmission we find under this hood. It actually uses an 8-speed automatic transmission by ZF. Even though all-wheel drive is standard in the A5, fuel economy is pretty good for the luxury segment, and the model we're driving is EPA rated for 27 miles per gallon combined. Because of the overall drivetrain layout and the fact that the front differential is part of that same transmission case, Audis generally have a front weight bias that is a little bit closer to your average front-wheel drive car than your average rear-wheel drive car, but things are a little bit different for the A5. Now, Audi has not said exactly how much weight is sitting on the front axle, but if we draw an imaginary line right up there from the center of the wheel on up, you'll notice that the engine is just about at that front axle point. And that apparently results in the best weight balance in the Audi lineup, short of the Audi R8. Now again, they haven't exactly told us what that weight balance is, but I suspect this is probably around 55-45 or perhaps 54-46. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this vehicle 9 out of 10 points. We have 4-way adjustable lumbar support and an extending thigh cushion. That applies to both the driver's seat and the front passenger seat. In addition to that, we have a tilt telescopic steering column with a very large range of motion and a 2-position seat memory over here on the door. As you'd expect from basically any coupe, the rear seats are a little bit compact, but if I hop back here, we do find a little bit more room than a number of coupes out there. Now, my head is still definitely touching the ceiling, and if I want my head to touch the headrest, I do have to crane it to one side. This is where the Audi A5 Fastback comes in, because if you want the coupe-like profile, but you want a little bit more comfort for your rear passengers, then that's the model for you. Now, call me a traditionalist, but in my vocabulary, A5 Fastback really just ought to be A5 Sedan, slightly different sedan than we see in the Audi A4. One big difference between the A4 and the A5, of course, is that we don't have a fifth seat in this vehicle. This is a strict 4-seat only, although we do have a third climate control zone back here. The rear seats fold in a 40-20-40 folding configuration. So this 40% side on the driver's side folds independently. Then we get this center 20 section that can fold down like that. That really improves cargo practicality in this vehicle, and of course it doesn't remove a seat in the process. Now you should know, if you want to fold the 40% side that I am sitting in right now, this center section does come with it. As we've come to expect from Audi, the A5 has quite an accommodating cargo area. You'll find 11.6 cubic feet of storage space back here that drops down to just under 10 cubic feet if you want the convertible version. And of course, if you want to carry a great deal of cargo in your A5, then the A5 Sportback will offer double the cargo capacity that we find in the coupe. A nice touch in the trunk is that we find handles to release the rear seat backs back here, so you don't have to crawl around the car to do it. You can even release the center section independent from the passenger side seat. Another welcome touch back here is that if we lift the cargo area load floor, we actually find a spare tire, and that's something that we don't see in that many European vehicles these days. The model we've been driving this week has a large moonroof, and as you can see, the cover is not completely opaque, so it does let a decent amount of light through. Now personally, that gives me a little bit of a headache. Be sure and let me know what you think about this down there in the comment section below. The driver and the front passenger get height adjustable seatbelts, and the headrests are 4-way adjustable. Forward and backward are manual, and up and down is a powered motion. As I said before, the front seats are quite comfortable, and the bolstering is fairly aggressive both on the seat bottom cushion and the seat back cushion. From this angle, you can see the extending thigh cushion. As you'd expect out of a luxury car in this category, the front doors are made from a majority of soft-touch plastics. We do find slightly harder plastics that are still squishy right down here at the bottom of the door. Instead of wood trim, the model that we're driving today has textured aluminum trim panels. The overall style of the dashboard is simple and elegant, and it pays homage to Audis of the past. You'll notice we have this large central vent right over here on the passenger side. The center vent is functional, but it's electronically controlled, so this control knob over here on the left side of your screen and the one over there on the right side of the screen control the vents on either side of this large central vent. Below that area, we have a medium-sized bin and slot style glove compartment. This is also where you'll find the Audi multimedia device interface. The glove compartment is a bin and slot style glove compartment. We have a small air conditioning vent back there to help keep things from getting a little bit too hot. And this is also where we find the Audi multimedia interface. We have 2 different SD card slots, the SIM card for the vehicle's MMI system, and a single slot optical disc player. Looking at the dashboard from above, we have a large Audi MMI screen mounted onto the dashboard, sort of like a tablet computer grafted into the dash. Instead of descending into the dash like other Audi models, this display simply turns on and off. The A5 gets Audi's latest MMI system, which features Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, in addition to the Audi Connect services. Audi Connect gives you weather, fuel prices, parking information, online news, and a variety of other different data services without using a smartphone connected to the system. These are all being delivered by the built-in LTE cellular modem. We also, of course, have that Apple CarPlay and Android Auto system, but unlike other vehicles, this does not use a touchscreen. Instead of a touchscreen, you interact with Apple CarPlay or Android Auto using the rotary dial. That does make interacting with the system just a little bit more complicated than vehicles that have a touchscreen interface, but you can do just about everything in this system that you would expect. Below that, we have 2 large air vents and then the controls for the 3-zone automatic climate control system. Even though those back seats are quite small, they actually have their own dedicated auto climate zone. In addition to being physical toggles, these buttons are also touch buttons, so I'm not actually pressing down on them, I'm just running my finger along them, and the system shows you what option is currently selected. So right now we're in auto, but it tells you that the fan is basically right there at 2. It also shows you over here that the 3 zones are in sync, and right up here it shows you that the vent on that passenger side, that large one between the 2 smaller ones, is currently open. And this is how you would close it. We can either choose to sync the system, we can have 3 separate zones, we can set the rear zone, or if we toggle all the way up, we can actually close that vent. Now you notice it's not showing open. If we want to open it again, we simply toggle right up there to open, and you'll notice it goes back to close. If we take our finger away for a while, it'll show that little icon again. Now, in case you're wondering, it is really more of a gentle breeze coming out of this large vent. We don't find hurricane force winds coming out of there. Below the climate control, we find the buttons for the Audi Drive Select. This allows us to choose between individual, dynamic, auto, and comfort. In the car that we're driving, that affects the way the steering, transmission, and engine behave, but if you opt for the model with the dynamic suspension, it can adjust that as well. This turns off and on the automatic start-stop system on the engine, disables the traction control system, parking sensor enable disable button, and the button to turn on and off the multifunction MMI display. Below that, we have our start-stop button, 12-volt power port, and a very small storage area, then 2 medium-sized cup holders, and then the controller for the Audi MMI system. There's some direct access toggles for the map and nav, the telephone interface right there, radio, and then media. It's a little bit difficult to see, but behind the large controller knob, we also have a menu button and a back button. Like the buttons in the climate control system, these are touch-sensitive buttons. So if you run your finger along them, the system will show you what option you're selecting, and when you press one down, this entire button bank actually depresses along with it. As with other versions of MMI, we find a rotary controller knob that rotates around, toggles up, down, side to side, clicks down to enter. We have two contextual menu buttons on either side that can be used in the system, and this surface features finger writing recognition. Behind that, we have a joystick-style toggle shifter. We press this button on the side and pull back for drive, toggle it once again for sport, move it over to the right for the manual mode, push away from the driver for gear up, pull towards the driver for gear down. If we pull it back towards the center, if you want neutral, that's one toggle forward with that little button right there, and then another one for reverse. Park is this button right here on the handle. To the right of the shifter, we find the power and volume knob for the infotainment system. We also toggle side to side for track forward and backward. Behind that, we find a small storage area, which is just about big enough to store the Audi's key. Between the front seats, we find a padded center armrest that slides forward and backward to cover this center console storage cubby. This is where we find our USB inputs and the auxiliary input. You'll notice if I close this, it doesn't cover this section quite completely, even if we slide it all the way forward. On the driver's side, we find one of the best LCD instrument clusters at any price in America. The only gauges that are not part of this 12.3-inch LCD instrument cluster are the engine temperature gauge over here on the left and the fuel gauge over here on the right. The instrument cluster is controlled via these buttons on the steering wheel. We have a back button, a view button, contextual buttons that toggle side to side, and then this rotary knob that rotates around and clicks to enter. In addition to your typical trip computer information and digital speedometer and digital tachometer, we have a number of other displays that we just don't see in many vehicles out there. This display gives you pretty typical vehicle information like vehicle safety system status, our trip computer information, infotainment information, etc. And if we toggle the view button, you'll notice we rotate between a view with the large speedometer and tachometer and smaller ones below. When the speedometer is shrunk down to the smaller size, we no longer have numbers, we have a digital readout, but then this little arrow still rotates around just like it would on the larger model. We then have contextual menus on each side, which allow us to change things like our input, and then if we toggle over to the right side, there are a few options based on what source you're playing. If we move back over to the trip computer screen, we have our trip computer information in the middle, and then some additional gauge readouts which can be adjusted on either side. Because I have a phone connected via Apple CarPlay, we can't interact with it using this LCD instrument cluster. But the real party trick here is the map display. The mapping display is run via the same software that runs the Audi MMI mapping interface, and it has Google satellite imagery in addition to real-time traffic data. The map display, of course, works with both views, whether you want the large speedometer and tachometer and the small map, or the big map and the smaller tach. Of course, once you've actually experienced this display, I can't imagine that many people actually choosing the layout that has the smaller map. If we zoom out, it's easy to understand why you might want this large display in the instrument cluster. Not only is it a little bit closer to the field of vision that you're normally looking out the windscreen, but it also allows you to do something completely different with the Audi MMI interface. You could, of course, choose to have the Audi MMI interface zoomed way out, or, of course, zoomed way in if that is more your preference. You could be using the telephone interface, or the radio interface, or the media interface, or even the Apple CarPlay interface right over here on the Audi MMI system, right like that. This really gives you even more flexibility than we find in systems that have a large screen that can be split in half. Zooming out from there, we find a 3-spoke steering wheel with aggressive sport grips up top and a split spoke at the bottom. Again, on the left side of the steering wheel, we have the buttons that control that multifunction LCD instrument cluster. We have these toggle buttons that are contextual. We can choose options or zoom in and out using this knob. The view button expands and contracts those dials, and of course we have the back button. On the right side of the steering wheel, we have a button to repeat navigation instructions, a favorite button which can be assigned in the system, voice command, phone button, and track forward, backward, volume up, down, and mute. On the back of the steering wheel, we find paddle shifters, down on the left, up on the right, and then behind the paddle shifters, we have the controls for the cruise control system on a stalk. 0 to 60 acceleration in the base A5 is absolutely excellent. Certain models of the BMW 430i will go from 0 to 60 just a hair faster, but the A5 is very, very competitive, and this vehicle has standard all-wheel drive. Generally speaking, competition to the Audi A5 with the 2-liter engine that's a little bit faster would generally be the rear-wheel drive models of the competition. And if you add all-wheel drive to those, they're going to be right about the same 0 to 60 time as the model that we're testing. So it's important to compare apples to apples apples, not apples to oranges, since this does come standard with Audi's Quattro system. Now, of course, this actually comes standard with two different Audi Quattro systems. If you get the manual transmission, then we get Audi's latest Quattro system with Ultra. Personally, I think that's kind of a funny name, but what that system does is it has a rear axle disconnect feature. We see that in a few other vehicles that are all-wheel drive, and it helps improve efficiency. If, of course, you're driving your A5 hard, it'll still be sending power to all four wheels. If you get the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission or the 8-speed automatic in the Audi S5, then we get a different Quattro system. This Quattro system has a solid rear-wheel drive power bias at all times. In our braking test, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in a very short 111 feet, which is very good for this category. This generation of the A5 really impressed me when it comes to handling. This feels a great deal lighter up front than the previous A5 did. Of course, we are driving the lightest model, which is the 4-cylinder model. If you get the S5, then there's a little bit more weight on the front axle because of that larger engine. Audi has really spent a great deal of time balancing the weight out in the A5, and it really shows. Now, this is likely not quite as well balanced as a BMW 4 Series, but you'd be hard-pressed to ever notice it out on the road. A lot of the difference is the suspension tuning both front and rear. Of course, we are driving the model with the S-Line package, which means we get the optional sport suspension in this particular vehicle. Bottom line, the A5 is one of the most engaging vehicles to drive out on the road. And in terms of overall handling ability, while this is just a little bit below the Cadillac ATS in certain trims, it is very, very good. Personally, I prefer the standard suspension setup in the Audi A5. I think it's an excellent balance between sporty handling and a well-polished ride, even out on rougher roads like we're on right here. I'm going to give the sport suspension-equipped model that we're driving a C when it comes to our overall ride score, but that goes up to an A if you were to get the A5 with the base suspension. The model we're driving, of course, also has slightly lower profile tires than we find in the base Audi A5, and that's part of the reason that this ride is going to be a little bit firmer and a little bit more punishing. In our cabin noise test, I scored 73.5 decibels, which makes this just a little bit louder than some of the competition. So I'm going to give this a B- when it comes to our overall cabin noise score. I think that has to do with the tires that are on this particular model. Over a week of mixed driving, fuel economy has been excellent. We've been averaging 28 miles per gallon, which is 1 over the EPA score. We can likely thank the efficient 2-liter engine and the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that we find under the hood. This is one of the smoothest DCTs that I have ever driven. This really excels at low-speed crawl. A lot of dual-clutch transmissions have troubles in low-speed situations. That would be in stop-and-go traffic, or if you're stopping on a hill and you want to accelerate very gently up the hill. They just have a really rough time at that. A perfect example is something like the Mercedes-Benz CLA or the Mercedes-Benz GLA. Those are really, really herky-jerky in those situations. But this actually feels almost like a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission. Although not strictly part of the drive section, the overall experience in the A5 is very, very easy to live with, especially this absolutely enormous and gorgeous LCD instrument cluster, which I hope you can see right there on your screen. For 2018, the A5 Coupe starts at $42,800. If you want the A5 Cabrio, that'll set you back $49,600. Feature content between the Coupe and the Cabrio is essentially the same, so you really are paying the extra for that power folding top. As you can see on this chart, the A5 is relatively well equipped for a luxury vehicle, although we don't find some of the active safety systems standard on here that we do find in the modern Lexus RC. If you want the extra power of the S5 Coupe or S5 Cabrio, that's going to set you back a decent amount more cash. That cash gets you not only the more powerful engine, but also the additional features you see listed. It is worth noting that you can get the A5 in all versions with either a 6-speed manual or a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission, but if you opt for the S5, then you can only get the 8-speed automatic. There are a few things you should keep in mind when you compare the A5 or the S5 to the competition. The first and most important thing to keep in mind is that all of the A5 and S5 models sent to the United States come standard with all-wheel drive. There are front-wheel drive A5s available in other world markets, but here they're all all-wheel drive. And that means that the driving dynamics overall are going to be different between the A5 and something like a 4 Series or a Q60 if you get the competition in a rear-wheel drive version. Now, the Audi Quattro system is going to send the majority of the power to the rear wheels when you start driving the vehicle hard, but the A5, because it has Audi's new Quattro system with Ultra, will actually default to front-wheel drive in order to save fuel. The other thing that Audi did in order to save fuel with the A5 is give it the excellent 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that we've been driving. That's responsible not only for the excellent fuel economy numbers, but also the very good performance figures we see out of this 2-liter turbocharged engine. There is just one drawback to the dual-clutch transmission in the A5. increased maintenance costs. You do have to replace the transmission fluid every 40,000 miles or so in the A5 with that 7-speed DCT. Now, we don't find the same maintenance window in the S5 because it does not use the DCT. Instead, it uses a traditional 8-speed automatic. That service should cost between $200 and $400 depending on where you live and who's doing the service. With that, let's dive right into the BMW 4 Series. The 4 Series comes in two main flavors that compete with the A5 and S5, the BMW 430i and the BMW 440i. Audi generally is going to put a little bit more standard equipment, most notably standard leather upholstery, inside their interiors. We don't necessarily find that inside corresponding BMW models. The BMWs also start out as rear-wheel drive vehicles instead of the standard all-wheel drive that we find in the Audi. Of course, if you jump on over to the 4 Series convertible, the 440i does come standard with all-wheel drive in America. The A5 versus 4 Series comparison is a little bit interesting because a lot of folks that I ran into this week expected that the 4 Series would be the better handling vehicle. It has essentially a perfect 50-50 weight balance, and of course it's a BMW 4 Series based on the 3 Series, so it should have excellent handling dynamics. But the truth of the matter is that BMW has really turned the 3 Series and 4 Series into softer and more luxurious vehicles over the years. Meanwhile, Audi has really been sharpening their claws with the A4 and the related A5. Driving the two cars back to back, you'll really notice that a perfect weight balance is not the only thing that factors into handling, because the A5 may be more front heavy than the 430i, but it actually has a more pleasing handling behavior out on the road. The reason for that, of course, is that while weight balance matters, the overall design of the vehicle and the overall design of the suspension also comes into play, and Audi has really tuned the A5 on the sportier end of things here. The all-wheel drive 430i will be a little bit faster 0 to 60 than the A5, and if you get the rear-wheel drive 430i, then we're talking 2 to 3/10 of a second faster than the Audi that we were driving. But the Audi's 7-speed dual-clutch transmission is actually a little bit more engaging than the ZF 8-speed that we find in the BMW or even in the Audi S5. While the A5 is definitely better balanced than A5s in the past, when you move on up to the S5, then the weight becomes a little bit more noticeable in the front of the vehicle. You should again also keep in mind that you can get a rear-wheel drive 440i, but you cannot get a rear-wheel drive S5. It is going to be all-wheel drive only. Next, we have the Mercedes-Benz C-Class Coupe. This starts at $43,200 for the C300. The C300 is notably slower 0 to 60 than the Audi A5. But then we have the Mercedes C43 AMG Coupe, and there's a huge difference in performance between it and the C300. At $55,900, it is a direct competitor to the Audi S5, but you're definitely going to pay a lot more for the Mercedes options than for options over there on the Audi. In terms of driving comparisons, the C43 AMG is definitely the handling winner when pitted against the Audi S5. That's not just because of the rear-wheel drive layout in the C43, although that certainly helps. It also has to do with the way the overall chassis is tuned and the overall balance we find in that Mercedes. On the downside, you're definitely going to pay more for that extra ability than you would in the Audi. And of course, if you want more power in your C-Class, you can definitely do that, because not only is there a C43 AMG, but there's also a C63 AMG and a C63S AMG with over 500 horsepower. As we see in some of the other recent Mercedes models, the interior in the C-Class really is a step above the competition, especially if you start taking a look at the C43 versus the 440i and the S5. The C-Class interior is just a nicer place to spend your time. There's more attention to detail, the fit and finish inside the cabin, the materials quality, etc. is better than the competition, but you're definitely going to pay extra for it. It's important to keep in mind that the extra cost is often wrapped up in options. So, for instance, the C43 AMG Cabrio is a little bit less expensive than the S5 Cabrio, but once you start adding options in order to comparably equip them, you will definitely pay more for the Mercedes. Next up, we have the Infiniti Q60, which is a relatively recent addition to this luxury coupe segment, even though the vehicle it's based on has been around for some time. The Q60 starts notably less than most of the competition in this segment, at $38,950. Interestingly enough, it actually uses the same 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine that the Mercedes C300 uses. But in the Infiniti, it produces 208 horsepower instead of 241 like we see in the Mercedes. And that means that the Q60 in base trim is going to be the slowest entry in this segment. When you start comparing price for price rather than base model to base model, things get a little bit interesting. Because for the price of a base Audi A5 or a base BMW 430i, you could buy a 300 horsepower Q60. Infiniti's new twin-turbo V6 definitely sounds better than the four-cylinder engines we find in the German competition, and it will also get you from 0 to 60 faster. In addition to that, Infiniti offers rear-wheel drive and all-wheel drive with all of their engine options. That's kind of a unique feature we see in the Infiniti lineup. Comparing price to price is important, because for the same price as the A5 that we were driving this week, which was an almost fully loaded 2-liter turbo version of the A5, you could actually get a nicely equipped 400 horsepower version of the Q60. Obviously, that's going to get you from 0 to 60 much faster than the A5. It will actually get you 0 to 60 just about as fast or possibly faster than the Audi S5, depending on the tires you put on the Infiniti. Grip is definitely a problem for the Infiniti Q50 and Q60 because they don't really change too much else other than the engine when they put more power under the hood. And that means that the tires really are a weak point in that vehicle, but you could definitely get more oomph for your dollar. Before we move on, it's worth noting that there is no convertible version of the Q60. That brings us on over to the Lexus RC. Like the Infiniti Q60, the RC lineup doesn't really match up to the German lineups directly. Things start out with the RC Turbo at $40,155, but you're not going to find the same level of performance in the RC Turbo as the Audi A5. That's because Lexus is probably not kidding when they say that engine produces about 240 horsepower, whereas the Germans are likely underrating all their engines. One step up from the RC Turbo is the RC 300, which uses a naturally aspirated V6 engine, producing 255 horsepower. But that's still not going to be as fast as the Audi A5 that we were driving this week. Then we get the RC 350. It'll go from 0 to 60 about as fast as the Audi A5, even though it produces more power. The engine does sound better than what we find under the hood of the Audi A5, but it's actually going to cost you more. From the RC 350, which is finally about the same performance that we find in the A5 that we were testing this week, things jump considerably on up to the RCF at $61,165. That will get you from 0 to 60 faster than the Audi S5, and it does use a wonderful sounding naturally aspirated 5-liter V8. However, the RCF is also difficult to categorize because it's sort of a tweener vehicle. It sits between something like an S5 and a future RS5. It sounds incredible thanks to its naturally aspirated V8, but it just doesn't have the same kind of power or torque that we find out of the competition's turbocharged 6-cylinder engines. On the flip side, of course, the RCF ends up being kind of a good deal when you compare it to top-end trims of the S5, the M440i, and the C43 AMG. You could get that next half step up in terms of overall performance and the absolutely incredible sounding 5-liter V8 for about the same kind of money. When you're taking a look at vehicles like the A5, the 4 Series, the C-Class, etc., it's important to remember that this category is a balance between sport and a grand touring kind of vehicle. This is the kind of category where ride quality is just about as important as performance, and balancing those two things out is really what makes an excellent vehicle in this segment. This is where the A5 really shines, because it has an excellent balance of handling, performance, technology, and of course a nice ride as well. And that makes the A5 my top pick if you're shopping between about $40,000 and perhaps $55,000 in this segment. If you're looking for the next level up in performance, then I would actually take the C43 AMG over the S5 or the 440i. The two big reasons for that are the driving dynamics we find in the C43 AMG and the interior that we find in the C-Class. The value pick in this segment really is the Infiniti Q60. For about the same price as the 240 to 250 horsepower entries in this segment, you could get at least 300 horsepower in your Q60. For the price of well-equipped 240 to 250 horsepower models, you could actually get 400 horsepower in your Infiniti Q60. Now the Q60 is a little bit rough around the edges. It kind of reminds me of a Japanese muscle car, but that's part of the fun factor in that Infiniti. Be sure to let me know what you think about the Audi A5 and whether you would take the A5 over its direct competition down there in the comments section below. Be sure to check out our related videos. Head over to facebook.com to see what we're driving this week. And if you want to support this channel, head over to patreon.com and find us over there. I'll see you next week.